Hello and welcome back to another episode of From the Ground Up. My name is Margaret Stouter. I'm the Registrar and Site Archaeologist here at Fort Ticonderoga. And for this episode we are going to be looking at buttons. Now I'm currently standing in front of one of our archaeological cabinets in our archaeological study room. And this is where we house our button collection. These buttons were once housed, however, in lots of bags with multiple buttons in each bag. They were getting crushed. It wasn't good for their conservation. So in 2019, one of our fellowship projects through our Edward W. Pell Fellowship Program was to rehouse the buttons. So now we have two beautiful displays that we have for our buttons, one of which is this great tray where we've taken certain typologies or certain representations from the button collection so that we can have them laid out for researchers and for any visitors who come through and see our collections to be able to see highlights from the button collection. And this includes buttons that are decorative, civilian buttons, as well as all the regimental buttons that were found here on the grounds of Fort Ticonderoga. Now, the vast majority of our button collection, which amounts to over 2,500 individual pieces, were discovered during the restoration of the fort in the early 20th century, so there isn't any ground provenience for these objects. However, they still tell us a lot about the people who were here and what they were wearing. Now, the top drawer was the sort of highlight collection. The rest of the drawers that contain buttons have this card system. So each button is put into an individual bag and given its own card with a label. And this allows the button then to be housed by itself so that it's not getting smushed or chipped away from having other metal objects around it. And it also allows us to very clearly see the object. Now, as I mentioned, we have regimental buttons, we have civilian buttons. They come in different metals, from brass to pewter, things that have been maybe tin-plated or silver-plated. They have different forms, some that have been cast as a one-piece or a two-piece. There's also bone buttons and wood buttons, so we have quite a lot of different forms, and we are going to now take a little closer look at them. Alright, so let's take a closer look at a few examples of buttons. Now, buttons have been used as clothing fasteners for hundreds of years, becoming a little bit more popular in use in the later medieval period. And we, of course, see them very much in use in the 18th century. And by the time of the occupation at Fort Ticonderoga in 1755, starting with the French building Fort Carillon, buttons are very much in use on coats and waistcoats, things like gaitered trousers, hats even. They're also being used on non-clothing materials as well as closures, but they're also used as decoration on clothing as well. So the buttons that we have before you on the screen are French military buttons, and during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, the French military is using unnumbered or undecorated buttons on their uniforms, and there are two different colors here on the screen. So we have a white metal, sort of a silvery colored one here in the left top, pewter button, and then we have these copper alloy or yellow colored buttons, and these would have then matched the uniform descriptions or the uniform standards for each regiment. So it wasn't necessarily that the officers were wearing a yellow button and the enlisted soldiers were wearing a silver button. It's that for instance, the Languedoc regiment would have been wearing boutons jaunes or yellow buttons, and the canonnier bombardier would have had these white buttons or boutons blancs. So it was very specific to the regiment. Now, there is some differences then between enlisted soldiers and officers, which we'll see in a moment when we turn the buttons over, but again, very specific to the regiment in terms of the color of the button. There's also going to be different sizes depending on where the button is on the uniform, so your coats would have larger buttons, your waistcoats would have smaller buttons. That's always not very specific, but usually the most common. Now, if we turn the buttons over, we can take a look at the backs, and this will show us a little bit more on how these buttons are made. So we have the top button is a poured molded button, and you can see there's a lovely mold seam that goes across the back here, and then the eye of the button would have been molded in at the same time. So this is a two-piece button. And this again is a white metal, so usually a pewter or some type of combination of pewter and tin button. The other two that we have here that have similar backs have a brazed eye on them. So there's a little bit more concave. They have this copper alloy front, and then if I can show it to you, there we go, is that lovely brazed eye that has been attached to the back of the front of the button. So that one's a larger coat button, and then this is more of like a waistcoat size. And again, it has that brazed back. The eye has been added on. And those three are enlisted soldiers' buttons. The one here is an officer's button. So this is a three-piece button. It has a lovely front that would have been gilded, and then we have a back here that would have been made from bone or wood, and it also has these holes that are punched in there, and those holes would have had something called catgut strung through it. And catgut is the intestines of sheep or horses or an animal where it's been dried and then turned into this very hard thread-like substance, rope-like substance, and that is strung through there, and then the button's put together so that when the button is attached to the uniform, it's not the catgut that's attaching it, rather that you have thread that is then attaching to the catgut, and that is then attaching it to the uniform. And you can see those holes are still there. Some of our examples that we have actually have some of that catgut that have been left in, which is pretty amazing. So these are three-piece buttons, these officers' buttons, and they have a little bit hardier form to them, and then when they were gilded and all shined up, they would have looked very impressive. So these are our French buttons from the French and Indian War period, and the French are here until 1759, at which point we have the British who take over the occupation of the fort, and we have a huge number of the over 2,500 buttons here in the collection. One of the largest collections of buttons that we have are these three-piece plain pewter buttons. Sometimes these are referred to more modernly as gas-back or gas-vented buttons, and these are sort of more dome top that are then added, soldered to the back of a flatter piece of pewter. And then there is usually an iron eye that is then attached. There's a little bit of a remnant on that one, and you can see there's a little bit of earlier conservation that has been done to this one. But this is a great example, this larger one right here, which would have been for a uniform, and this smaller one, again, mostly for a waistcoat. But you can see the two holes in the back that are very common to this type of button, and would have been used on British enlisted uniforms through the 1760s into the 1770s. And the form of this likely being found both in military context but also in civilian context as well. And those holes, there's research that sort of says that the holes have to do with gas venting out while the metal was cooling after the two halves of the button have been sealed together. So while the majority of buttons that we have are undecorated plain buttons, we do have a number that are decorated, and that includes our numbered military buttons. Now, the buttons that are before you here on the screen are British numbered buttons, and the British Army starts to incorporate numbered buttons through the warrant of 1768, which lists out different regulations. It includes saying that British enlisted soldiers should have pewtered buttons with numbers on them. And we have a few different examples here of British regiments that served here at Fort Ticonderoga or came through the area with British armies, or in one case, it was never here at all. So the first two buttons are from the 26th Regiment of Foot, and we have a smaller waistcoat button and then a larger coat button here. The 26th Regiment first arrived in America in 1767, and then here at Fort Ticonderoga in 1772, and was famously here on May 10, 1775 under Captain William Delaplace as a guard when the fort was captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. Now, when we turn these around, we can see how they are made on the back. These are two-piece buttons, and a lot of the British buttons in this period are going to have the pewter front and then have a iron eye that has been added to the back of the button. And there's a little foot of pewter material that incorporates that iron eye. And this one actually is a modern or more modern iron eye that's been added to the back of that button, and then this one you can see the iron eye has eroded away. So this is the 26th Regiment of Foot. And the 53rd button that we have here, the 53rd Regiment first arrived in America in 1776. They were part of the garrison of Fort Ticonderoga when the fort was captured, or parts of the 53rd, I should say, were captured during Brown's raid in September of 1777. So the fort itself wasn't captured, but parts of the 53rd, especially the ones that were down on the north end of Lake George by the sort of portage site, were captured by American troops that had come in to sort of rattle up the British army that was at Fort Ticonderoga. So this was deposited on the site sometime in 1777. Now we have this 47th Officer's button, which if we turn it over, you'll see that this has a bone back, and then it would have had an eye that would have attached to it. And we have this beautiful embossed hammered front, and this one has some insignia on it. So it has a crown with a lion above it, and the 47th beneath. And the 47th Regiment served under Burgoyne and didn't really spend much time here at Fort Ticonderoga, but did head south to the end of Lake George, where they would have then traveled back and forth also during the retreat back to Canada after their loss at Saratoga in 1777. So this then would have been deposited sometime on the site during that year. Now, the button here is from the 22nd Regiment of Foot, and this regiment never served at Fort Ticonderoga. However, a ship carrying uniforms of the 22nd Regiment, a British ship, sailed into the Delaware Bay in 1775, and it was quickly captured by the Continental Army, and then those supplies that were on that ship were distributed to other areas. So the 22nd buttons make their way to Boston. They're going to be put on American soldiers, and then at some point this button makes its way up here on an American soldier using these British uniforms, and then was lost on the site when the Americans were using the fort somewhere between 1775 and 1777. So these buttons speak a bit to the British soldiers that were here, the occupation period, the times that they would have maybe been depositing them. But in the case of the 22nd button, it also speaks to the history and the usage of these clothing, not just by the British Army, but by the American Army. And again, you can see the little iron eye is missing, but this is a two-piece button. Turning now to our American made buttons. The Continental Army was adapting those similar regulations that the British Army and at this point the French Army also had, with numbering their buttons for the regiments or the battalions that the uniforms or the soldier was associated with. And these again were all found here on site. And we have the first top left corner is our 8th Continental Regiment, this one being formed out of New Hampshire, and it has this very sort of plain pretzel looking 8 on the top of it, and also a very simple pewter casting with that mold seam in the back. A lot of the American buttons are very professionally made, but a portion of them are not being professionally made here in America. They are being cast just on site, sometimes even with lead, a little bit heavier than pewter. And in this case, also just being adapted from plain buttons. So this is a remarkable piece here. This is a 14th Continental Regiment button, but what's remarkable about this one is that the 14 has been scratched on there. So this has been added to a uniform where the button has been lost. And they wanted to make sure that they still had their regiment's number attached to their uniform, so they had scratched that onto a plain button. Now we have a 4th Pennsylvania Battalion button here. They are famously at Fort Ticonderoga in 1776, and they are stretched out particularly on what is known as the French lines, where the Battle of Carillon happened, living in huts. And this one has a 4BP that's on it, and again a pewter cast button. The USA buttons start getting adapted into uniform regulations and being made in the later part of the war, so by 1777 and later, which is a little bit past the date that the American occupation is here at Fort Ticonderoga. With the British Army capturing the fort in 1777. So this one likely lost after the American troops were here in 1777, between then and 1783 when the war was over. And again, this one has a little bit of modern conservation on the back, but these are all these one-piece molded pewter buttons. And you'll notice that they have a little bit of a bigger eye hole on them. So a lot of times with these buttons, they're not necessarily being individually attached to a coat, rather having a piece of linen tape that goes across and is anchored into the uniforms, lapels, and the sides of the coat, and then strings in these buttons. So it was a much faster attachment process. So now we're going to turn to decorated civilian buttons, of which we have many different styles and sizes. I highly recommend going onto the Ticonderoga online collections database so you can see more photographs of these amazing different buttons, the different designs that we have. And these would have been used in the 18th century by soldiers and civilians, and they also would have been used by the different travelers coming to the site in the 19th century to see the ruins of the fort. Now the buttons here on the left are hammered metal buttons that are mimicking basket weave, and so this is just the front of the button. It's missing its bone or wood back and then the eye, but they're just, the detail on them is just amazing. The little one up here is again the front of a button and has a very delicate detail of a Scottish thistle. The one below it is really incredible. This is an imitation of a death's head button, and those are usually made out of thread. So far we've looked at metal buttons, but they're also using fabric buttons in the 18th century, covering those wood or bone forms with fabric. But of course that doesn't stay archaeologically. So this would have usually been made out of thread, that design, but instead here they've created a casting of that in metal, and that has mimicked that look very lovely. Now, the one right here is larger than the rest of them. This is more of a 1790s or 19th century button. It has this beautiful cast floral pattern on it. A lot of our civilian buttons have a little bit of gilding left on them, so especially with the relief, that design, if you put gilding over these buttons, the pattern of them would pop really nicely. And this is just such a nice large button, and on a coat or some type of garment it would have really popped out and you would have seen that design. Now we've looked so far at metal buttons, so most of them being pewter or some type of copper alloy like brass, but we have a few examples of other types of buttons, some of them made here, like this lead button that I've just put down, which is thick and very heavy. It also has those 4 holes that have been put into it, so whether that was being used for catgut or just being attached regularly with thread, but certainly being made here on site. And then we have this scrap metal button, which has very rough edges to it, and it has one center hole, so this could have been used as an individual button, or it might actually have been a replacement for a button back, and we'll look at button backs in a moment. And then we have these leather buttons here on the right, and these were found during excavations of the Boscawen in the 1980s. And the Boscawen was a British sloop that was built in 1759, and after it wasn't being used anymore, it was left to rot in place off the coast of the peninsula here by 1767. So these leather buttons sunk then down into the soil beneath the water, and it's a very anaerobic environment, so it's really great for preserving leather objects like these buttons. So we have 2 little holes here, and then this button is just the remnants of one, but it has this really beautiful sort of carved floral or star pattern that would have then had more of a circle around it. Now, we've looked so far at the front of buttons, but we have some wonderful examples here of how they're making these bone backs of the buttons, and these were found again here archaeologically, and this is a beef rib. So we know that they're making buttons here based off of these findings, and they would have then used a circular tool to cut out that form and then been able to put the circle in them. So here's the sponge of the bone. This is where they haven't pressed through fully those buttons. On this one they have, so we've just left with these cavities of where the button molds would have been. And then here's an example of that button cut out. So you can see the sponge of the bone. We have that circle there in the middle for attaching the eye. And we actually have another example of how that was done here to finish up putting your button together. So we've seen all these fronts, we've seen now that bone middle, and then here's an example of where the bone backing now has an eye that's put through, and the eye has been smushed a little bit on that side, but you can see then where it's been pushed down the metal to attach it nicely, anchor it to the bone, and then this section here would be in the interior of the button and hidden. But this allows the eye to not fall off in these 3-piece buttons. Now, again, I recommend checking out the Ticonderoga Online Collections database so you can see these buttons a little bit more in person. Thank you for joining me for another episode of From the Ground Up. To learn more about upcoming Center for Digital History programs, please visit our website at www.fortticonderoga.org. And to keep up to date with what the Collections Department is working on, you can visit us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you again for your support, and I look forward to seeing you next time.